How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? We're really fucked now. How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? We're really fucked now. For the sea level rise falls down from the skies, washing all who ignore it away.
Good morning, Tony Matthews with ABC News. Residents of Collaroy on Sydney's northern beaches are anxiously awaiting the arrival of high tide due in just a few minutes. Reporter David Taylor is there.
Engineers have begun assessing the storm damage to houses on the beachfront at Collaroy. Sandbags were put in place overnight to prevent further damage to property. A high tide is expected at 10:15 a.m. local time. SES controller Wayne Lynn says the rising tide has the potential to cause further damage.
The water actually breaks up over behind the wall. When it's low tide, the waves are crashing like further back out at sea.
It's still unclear when residents will be able to return to their homes.
The council covering Collaroy Beach says it'll be meeting with property owners badly affected by the storms today. The General Manager of Northern Beaches Council, Mark Ferguson, says the council is considering a third seawall for the area to be partly funded by homeowners.
We'll be discussing with the administrator today and looking for a way forward to attempt to resolve the issue. At the same time, it will require the cooperation and support of the property owners and the council.
Meanwhile, residents in parts of Sydney southwest and on the state's north coast haven't been allowed to return home, with water levels dropping slowly. The SES says while some residents in Chipping Norton were allowed home, others have been told to wait. Parts of North Lismore are still under evacuation orders. On the state's south coast, around 800 residents remain isolated near the Bega River. The Tasmanian government is providing emergency aid to people who've lost homes and property in the floods. Families will have access to up to $750, $200 per adult and $100 per child. Other support measures are being explored and officers are helping farmers with stock management. The Primary Industries Minister, Jeremy Rockcliffe, says the floods are a national disaster. He says farmers have lost so much and most of them won't be insured.
Spoken to a number of farmers, vegetable processors, and the situation is catastrophic for them. There's been huge losses of stock. I'm aware of farmers that have lost over 200 head of stock, dairy cattle and beef cattle, logs smashed through houses, irrigators mangled, mess.
A judge in the US is...
For the sea level rise falls down from the skies, washing all who ignore it away. Collaroy Beach has lost 50 metres, so the surf line is now pounding the walls of 7 houses or so. It's knocked down their surf club. I think 3 people are dead, 3 are still missing. There's been hundreds of flood rescues of people who thought that their desire to drive through floodwaters meant that their car became a Sherman tank. January, February, March, April, and I think May were the hottest months of that name on record. So let's have a little bit of a look at what climate science news there might be in the latest New Scientist magazine that I own. Dateline, 28 May 2016. Headline, Earth's sensitive side, with an info box titled Crunch Time, Double CO2 by 2050, and a subheading, Low Warming Fantasy. So in order to make sense of the rest of the article, we're going to commence with the information box Crunch Time, Double CO2 by 2050. The immediate warming in response to a doubling of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere is known as the transient climate response. As other feedbacks kick in, such as changes in vegetation, warming continues. Since pre-industrial levels of CO2 were around 280 parts per million, you might think a transient climate response of, say, 2 degrees Celsius means the world will warm this much when CO2 levels pass 560 parts per million. You'd be wrong. That's because CO2 isn't the only greenhouse gas we are emitting. There is also methane, nitrous oxide, and others. If their levels are translated into CO2 equivalents, the effective level of CO2 is already around 490 parts per million and on course to pass 560 parts per million long before 2050. However, we are also emitting aerosols, which are bad for our health but have a cooling effect. Countries such as China are trying to slash aerosol emissions to clean up their air, as Europe and the US have done already. If they succeed, warming will accelerate and the world will pass 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels not long after the CO2 equivalent level passes 560 ppm. If aerosol pollution remains high, it will take longer. So to the article, Earth's sensitive side, our planet may warm much more for a given level of CO2 in the air than we first thought. Michael LePage reveals why. We may be in for more global warming than we hoped, new scientists can reveal. Over the past few years, a number of studies have concluded that a given level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere produces less warming than previously thought. This rare good news on climate made headlines around the world. But these studies were carried out towards the end of a period of little warming. Do the results still stand given the record warming in 2014, 2015 and 2016? To find out, new scientists asked those behind the studies what would happen if the latest global temperature data was plugged into their models. One headline-making 2013 study had concluded that the immediate warming that would result from a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere would be around 1.3 degrees Celsius, significantly less than most previous estimates. If correct, this would mean we still have a chance of limiting warming to below the, quote, dangerous, unquote, point of 2 degrees Celsius despite soaring CO2 levels. But this was before temperatures shot past 1 degree Celsius above pre-industrial levels last year, as predicted by a new scientist in July 2015. If the 2013 study was repeated using that value, it would give an estimate for the immediate warming of 1.6 degrees Celsius, says Piers Foster, one of the study's authors based at the University of Leeds, UK. If we assume that the average global surface temperature in 2016 will be a record-breaking 1.3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level, as expected, the estimate would be closer to 2.1 degrees Celsius, Foster says. But that may be an overestimate due to the current spike in warming caused by a now fading El Nino. Quote, maybe 1.6 degrees Celsius is closer to the truth, he says. Indeed, he points out that 1.6 degrees Celsius is well within the uncertainty bounds of his 2013 study. Even before the recent warming, several other studies had already concluded that the 2013 estimate of the immediate warming effect was too low. These suggested that Foster's team underestimated how much warming has been masked by the cooling effect of other pollutants, such as sulfur aerosols that we pump out alongside CO2. In 2014, Drew Schindel of Duke University concluded that the immediate warming in response to a doubling of CO2 would be around 1.7 degrees Celsius. A 2015 study by a team including Gavin Schmidt of NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York got the same result. And this year, Trude Storolevmo of the Yale University put it at an alarming 2 degrees Celsius. Worse still, none of these later studies used any temperature data from after 2010. If they were repeated with the latest data, Schindel, Schmidt and Storolevmo all say the estimated value would be a little higher. Quote, the estimate would probably be slightly higher if we had included data up to the present, Storolevmo says. We are in the process of doing that. Only Schindel put a number on how much higher, guesstimating that his approach would produce a value of 1.8 rather than 1.7 Celsius. The reason these estimates are only slightly higher despite the record warming we have seen over the past couple of years is because the study methods were designed to minimise the effect of short-term temperature variations. Another few years of similar values will be another story, Schmidt says. In other words, if rapid warming continues in a longer term, perhaps after a slight fall in 2017 due to the effects of La Nina, all estimates of climate sensitivity based on the warming over the past century would increase considerably. Subhead: Low Warming Fantasy. The bottom line is that low values for the immediate warming in response to a doubling of CO2 can now be ruled out. Similarly, low values for the warming in the decades following a doubling of CO2 can also be ruled out. In its last report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, changed its estimate of warming after a doubling of CO2 from between 2 and 4.5 degrees Celsius to between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius, based on studies like Foster's. This relatively minor change was seized upon by climate change deniers as proof that the dangers of global warming had been exaggerated. The next IPCC report will be revised back upwards, Schindel thinks. But the IPCC was right to lower it when it did, he says. Its reports have to be based on the evidence available at that time. While we can now rule out low estimates of climate sensitivity, Schindel says, we cannot rule out high estimates. Quote, there's a long tail of very high sensitivity that should dominate our thinking, he says. When we buy house insurance, we take the worst case scenarios, fires and floods, into account, Schindel points out. With climate change, we should also act based on the worst case scenarios. And it's kind of interesting that the climate scientists mention insurance as a way of thinking about global warming, because what the New South Wales Premier said this morning on the radio news was that there wasn't anything much the government could do about people whose waterfront, beachside homes had been destroyed by the unusual winter monsoon storm that just swept down the east coast of Australia. He said because it's a case of caveat emptor, they should look very closely at the fine print of their insurance policy, and they should be aware that most insurance companies have exclusion clauses that decline to cover damage done by the sea. They class that as an act of God, and it's a case, he said, where the government can't do anything much except to discourage people from buying waterfront homes and to suggest that when they're weighing up the decision to buy the place or not to buy the place, they should consider the predictable possible negative consequences and downsides of acquiring the property, as well as the beneficial amenities to go with becoming the owner of the place. For the sea level rise falls down from the skies, washing all who ignore it away. How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? We're really fucked now. How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? How fucked are we now? We're really fucked now. Wobbles on at the YouTube. Ciao.